How's your relationship with yourself? We often think we know ourselves well, but in reality, we're too busy living and reacting to the demands around us to notice the way our thoughts, feelings, and actions influence our experience in the world. This week, I talk with Pallavi Srivastava, executive coach and author of the book Relationship with the Self, about why it's so important to build better relationships with ourselves. Here we also talk about how to better understand our inner critics and what to do to manage them more effectively. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Pallavi. It is such a pleasure to have you here, and I am really excited to dive in. I'd love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you for having me over this podcast. I am Pallavi Srivastava, and I am founder and CEO of the Wellbeing Ways LLC. I'm an executive coach. I am very involved with a nonprofit called Women in Enterprise of Science and Tech. I'm on their advisory board. I just wrote a book, which is called Relationship with the Self and Actionable Inputs Towards Your Personal Growth. I don't know how much, but I have had quite an interesting journey. So this is not my first professional instinct. And I started with about 18 and a half years ago as a business journalist with a degree in psychology and a degree in business administration. So I had all that and I loved writing. So I decided, I should go and become a business journalist. And I had a lot of fun first few years, but then I really burnt out bad and I had to one day just walk out. I could not take it. I tried leaving, but all these expectations around work, society, and our identity. But that burnout really set me on a different path. I took a year off. I went back, studied more on psychology, did a lot more training just to kind of figure out what was going on with myself. And once I had that, and I had that recovery, I realized this is what I want to do. So I became a therapist. This is all back in India. I was in India at that time. And so I became a therapist with a lot of focus on well-being, both professional and personal. And that's what I was doing for about 7-8 years. When I met a very old friend, was at that time going through coach training. And she was like, I need more hours to practice. Will you help? I'm like, always happy. And I raised my hand. She worked with me and that was amazing. She was just in training, just starting out. But I think just that skill of coaching, the way it helped me look at myself, understand myself, was just, I would say mind-blowing in a way, because I always thought I know myself so well, especially after the burnout, after being the therapist. But that deeper understanding also from a space of looking forward, what do I want in my life? And then aligning my action in the present towards what I want, right? It just changed a lot of things for me personally in that short period of few months of coaching that she did with me. And I realized now this is what I want to offer to the people that I work with. And I got trained as a coach. And, I've been now I am a full-time coach and I'm really enjoying doing that. I moved to the US, to Cambridge about 3 years ago. And that's when I incorporated my company here again. And I got retrained here with CTI, the Coactive Training Institute. And I'm having a lot of fun working with people on their journey.
I love it. And I love what you talk about in your own journey of getting to know yourself, because I think we assume that we know ourselves because we live with ourselves all the time. But I often joke, right? Like, who's asking themselves questions like, who am I? Right? We are so busy, focused on our to-do lists and all of the demands from the people around us. We are not, generally speaking, most of us taking time for deeper reflection. And so I think resources, whether it's coaching, whether it's journaling on our own, anything that we can do to better get to know ourselves is so powerful and so important, especially in a world where there's just so much overstimulation, so much noise, so much anxiety, right? So I love that that was your experience that led you to want to provide that support to others.
Yes, no, absolutely. And when you were saying that, there was this metaphor that came to my mind, how we talk about how we are not listening to each other, really just hearing the words,
Mm.
right? In workplace, people talk about this, and people are saying that how important it is to really truly listen, not just hear the words. People talk about this in relationships, in professional situations, and I'm thinking, or at least that's what, like, I think, how often are we actually listening to ourselves?
Mm.
we, because of what you said, there's so much noise, there's so much chaos, there's so much going on, that sometimes we can fall into the habit of just hearing for ourselves and not really deeply listening.
I'm so glad you said that too, because that's one of my personal, I would say personal journeys, but also one of my missions to help other people do is to not just accept at face value what we're telling ourselves and to not just kind of brush past it, but to actually examine it, to actually slow down, push the pause button and say, hold on a second. What am I really saying to myself right now?
Yeah.
Where's this coming from? How does it serve me? Right? Like, is this true? Whose voice is this? Right. And so I would love to talk a little bit more about your book too, because I know that's a big part of it. And I wonder if you could, first of all, share a little bit about what inspired you to write it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have a interesting story. I would probably share the story. So this started while there was a period where I was doing, back in India, therapy and coaching both. So it was a mix. My practice was a mix of both, depending upon who I was working with. And so I was seeing a lot of theme, or noticing a lot around how people are looking at themselves, thinking about themselves, feeling about themselves, and most importantly, what are their behavior towards themselves. And then I was working with this particular client. He was in his early 20s, and so young, very ambitious, wanting to do a lot of things for himself, high achiever. And it was just shocking to hear someone like that talk about how disappointed they are in themselves, how they're never meeting their expectations, and how harsh their thoughts were about themselves. And and it kind of goes on session after session. And then when I asked, like, how do you want, if you're sharing all this with your girlfriend, how do you want her to respond to you right now? And he was like, I of course want her to be kind and supportive and tell me that's how these things are not true, and remind me what are the things I've done well and things like that. And I said, what if she does not do that? And what if she is like, yeah, you are this because this is what you deserve, because you are not working hard enough, and that's what, why else would you fail? Like, that would not be nice. That's not a healthy relationship, because that's not what I expect. And I say, yeah, but what are you giving yourself then?
Hmm.
And it's not something that I thought about it. It's just something that happened in the conversation. And I remember, like, his words were like, oh my God, I didn't ever think about it like this. Like, I'm constantly seeking kindness, and all this treated, being wanting to treat it with respect, love, affection, compassion, understanding, all these things I'm seeking from other people, which is nothing wrong with that. But I am so not ever, I never thought about offering that to myself, or I never even realized that I'm not doing that for myself. And he was like, oh, I cannot even imagine what life would be like if I have a warmth for myself if I create that, if I create that understanding, like another voice, being supportive of me. So how different that would be. So that's how, just after that session, I was like, wow, that is really about relationship with self. That was the first time I thought about it. And then from there, one thing led to other, and I was like, another thing is I tried to research a little bit more on this, and I realized there is not much content on the subject on relationship with self as a whole. So I was like, why not?
So what is your big lesson from this experience, right? Like when it comes to our relationships with ourselves, like what are the big things that we're missing?
I think the biggest thing that we are missing or we don't focus on is our behavior towards ourselves. And I think it's so easy. So there are three components of relationship that I talk about, especially in context with self, is how am I seeing myself or perceiving myself? So are my thoughts and beliefs. How am I feeling about myself? So compassion, kindness, all that. And then what it is my action or my behavior towards myself? How am I treating myself? A lot of times that gets unnoticed, and that was even just writing the process of writing that for my book helped me look at for those things for myself. And so what I mean by what is my behavior towards myself is like, let's say there's a leader as a person, you worked really hard on a project for your job. You put in long hours, you worked really hard, you really stretched out of your comfort zone, and you expected a certain outcome and it didn't happen, right? What happens to you then? It's again, so it's human to have some rejection, to have some sadness, to feel a low. That's human. But does it stop there, or does, and you talk about imposter syndrome a lot, so it relates with that and some more. Or so does that stop after having that initial emotional reaction, or what's the conversation that goes on in your head when that happens, when life is not going the way you want? Are you go on saying, I deserve this, I don't have it in me, that's why this happened? Or do you start doubting your capabilities? You feel like other people are better than you. So when this is the kind of conversation that starts happening, and you start thinking that probably I am, that's where I am shitty, or I didn't do well enough. When you start taking those feelings and thinking of them as facts, and then what do? You probably, and this is an example, you hold yourself back and you say, maybe next time I should not take on challenging projects. Maybe I should not work hard. So you see this, it's slowly turning into your action.
Yes.
Of holding yourself back. And what I like to give a good example, which people can use and it helps a lot, is thinking of it. I read about it somewhere online that Buddha says, don't shoot the second arrow. And he talks about that in life, you cannot avoid first arrow. So if you're living a human life, you're working, and in your personal life, you would fail. You will make mistakes. Things would not go your way. That's the first arrow. We cannot avoid the first arrow, right? But then when that happens, how do I treat myself? When I fail, do I become a failure? Right? When I lose, am I a loser? There's a difference. I can fail without becoming a failure. I can lose without becoming a loser. And I think that's the part where action towards self comes and plays a very important role. Blaming versus taking responsibility, setting boundaries, right? You work with a lot of people in the corporate space. You would understand how important it is to set boundaries. And like that's the other thing I wrote about in the book, but that's also something that shows up a lot in my work. And I just find it surprising how people have a strong instinct against setting boundaries, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so it's a journey to understand that, and they think, oh, how will they be perceived? If you're a successful leader at the top and now you need to set boundaries of how, there's work, there's life, there are things, you feel like, oh my God, I might be seen as, not committed, not responsible, and all that comes up. So that's a need that you have. That's a behavior towards yourself. No, I deserve to set these boundaries. So yeah. So for me, the action towards self were most revealing in the process of writing the book.
Yeah, and it makes so much sense how these different components build on each other, right? So, like you're saying, it could either be that I choose not to take the risk in the first place because I tell myself that I'm not worthy of it, I'm not ready for it, I'm not capable of it. Or I take the risk, it doesn't go well, and then I say, see, I never should have done that. And I'm now going to play small going forward. And each action that follows shapes the narrative that we hold about ourselves. And so
Yeah,
we just keep reinforcing it and we look at the world through that filter.
absolutely. Absolutely. And in that moment, that filter looks like the reality.
Mm.
It's so hard to even think that there are different filters,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
you're absolutely right. And I think that's when you talk about like your feelings being facts, right? It's like it just feels obvious to us. No, that's just the truth, right? As opposed to that's a feeling that I have in this moment. And that often those feelings, often those thoughts are self-protective in a
Yeah.
way that can be counterintuitive, right? But that usually there's a purpose behind them
Yeah. I'm so
that
glad you're pointing to that protective piece.
yeah, say more about that.
Yeah, because again, so when people start initially working towards these harsh voices, including the one of an imposter voice within ourselves. And I think before I progress more talking about voices, I just want to say a little bit about how we are always talking with ourselves in our head. We're always thinking, we're always commenting in what we are doing about what's going on in our life. And those thoughts, we hear them like voices, whether we realize that or not. That's how humans work. So now that I've set up a little bit context for the voices, I feel like imposter syndrome can, for people who face that, it's kind of a voice that has become loud probably, or at least has a significant voice in your head. And
Hmm.
what I was saying was, I'm glad that you pointed out that is protective is because when people first realize, oh, they have an imposter syndrome, they think instinctively to shun that voice.
Hmm.
Oh, that's a bad thing about me, right? And what happens when you do that? You start an internal war.
Yes.
Now the imposter voice is like, I'm gonna now prove. So it gets louder, and you're like, I want to, and you feel like, what's going on? Like, I thought I was making progress with this. I was collecting evidence against it. And now suddenly this one thing happened, unexpected thing in life. And now this voice is screaming at its top. And so instead of doing that, if you bring empathy and kindness, which can feel very hard to a mean voice in your head, but if you bring that empathy and kindness and that wanting to really deeply listen, you would find out it's a protector. It's probably just scared that you will let yourself down.
Yes.
You will not meet your expectations or other people's expectations. So it's just scared. And it thinks that if it keeps reminding you that you don't have high expectation of yourself, that you can avoid all that heartbreak when you fail.
Yes. I'm so glad you said that because I definitely think that it's rooted in fear, right? It's rooted in fear. And to your point, if I tell myself this, then I am bracing myself against external feedback that says I'm not good enough, right? Like now I'm protecting myself from that, or I'm protecting myself from even putting myself in a position of finding out because I've already convinced myself that it's not worth the risk. And so I do think when you think about a voice as being critical, it's hard to be compassionate towards it. But if you think about a voice as being afraid, right?
Yeah.
It's easier to show empathy and support to it, just as we would to a child that's fearful, right? We're not going to try to kick the child away.
Absolutely. Since I also have this therapy background, and what I notice often, if you dig a little deeper, you probably picked that imposter voice sometime in that early years of your life,
Yeah.
right? Probably a parent who was trying to be protective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, at least in Asian cultures, it's a thing. You always, you don't praise the success as much. You tell them all the things they're doing wrong. They think that's the way to succeed. So, like, you probably had a parent or a teacher or other adults around, and somewhere in those formative years, anytime from early childhood to up to, you become an adult, you are even more impressionable. So you build these defense mechanisms. So another thing that I noticed is that when that shows up in imposter syndrome voice shows up in my work with a client, often it's got that childlike, teenager-like, quality to it.
That's a really good point. And I think, when we talk about that being a protective mechanism and a fear-based voice, it makes sense because when we're children, we don't have power, right? And so we don't have the same even capacity for reason that we have as adults. And so we're trying to make sense of our worlds. We're trying to keep ourselves safe. We're trying to make sure that we can trust the people that are responsible for our safety, right? And so that's where a lot of these voices and these messages develop. And then we don't, going back to the relationship with self, re-examine them later. We don't stop and say, oh, that helped me survive my childhood, but do I still need that thinking as an adult? Right?
You read my mind. So that's that's a very important part in the book that I do, I talk about again, is that you, that worked probably. That protection worked when you were so young. You needed to feel safe. Great. So you probably had a conscious or unconscious kind of agreement with this voice that you will protect me, and so that I will have my expectations in check and will stay safe and will survive. But now I'm a 40-year-old woman, or the person that I'm working with is a 48-year-old man, or like, we are adults, and we are totally capable of handling when we fail.
Yes.
We are totally capable of handling heartbreak. It will hurt. It will hurt if you fail, if you put a lot of work into something and it didn't um, go the way you wanted it to go. If you love someone passionately and they don't reciprocate, you will have some kind of heartbreak, pain. But as adults, we also know how to move forward beyond that, right? We are safe. We can take care of ourselves, and then we have support that we understand that as an adult. And so that's the redesign I talk about in a book, where I gave like exact steps of when these kind of voices start. You first make them realize, look, great, you did a great job for a certain period of time, but this is not what's working for the adult me. When I am, leading a company, I have this big startup, and if I constantly have you telling me to have low expectation, how am I, gonna meet expectation, or how am I gonna even shoot for the things that I'm supposed to shoot for as leading this company? So my priority and my needs as an adult could be thriving and not surviving. And
Mm-hmm.
I embrace failing, and I embrace the risk, so I am going to handle this, and I want what's a new role you would want to have, like, so you go step by step. First you listen, then you empathize, then you talk about, oh, you know I'm the adult, I'm taking charge, this is what we want. And then you get that just like you would get a team on board, you get that voice on board. Don't you think life will be great if we approach it this way? And that imposter voice would slowly start to listening in, because you listened in, you understood, and you're offering what they really want, not what you think they want at the surface. What they really want is for you to do good,
Yes.
and you are meeting that need by doing this. So that, and it's beautiful to do, to take someone through that. And it's beautiful when it's hard in the moment, but it's beautiful to see how it can change, something that felt like would never change.
Yeah, I love the way you describe that. And I often think about it too as, do we want to live in alignment with fear, or do we want to live in alignment with our core values, right?
Yeah.
And so much of it is in the very moment when we're faced with that decision, it's easy to prioritize fear because that feels like the safest option, the obvious option if we are anxious by nature, if we're trying to protect ourselves. But if we zoom out and we look at the arc of our lives and we imagine ourselves even 20 years from now looking back on this moment,
Yeah.
what are we going to wish we had done,
Yeah.
right? And most of the vast majority of humans are not going to get to the end of their lives and think, God, I wish I had been more fearful, right? I wish I had prioritized fear and protecting myself over taking risks and trying new things and challenging myself, right? And so to really try to balance that voice of fear with the voice of like, how do I want to show up in the world? How I want to show up for myself? How do I want to show up for others? Right. And then gradually you start to chip away at the fear, and things feel less scary when you take those risks.
Yeah. And that's so, I love what you're pointing to about values, about how do I want to show up. And that's what happens when we start and try or make an effort to live beyond the fear, right? That's the important piece. So staying in that fear and trying to just avoid fear is one way to live, but that would shrink you. You're only like, imagine driving on the road and only thinking that, oh, just avoid hitting any car. You would. I also feel like because you're thinking so much, you would probably end up hit. Like, I was more recently taking driving lessons, so I know that I would always look on the cars on the side and think I need to not touch them. And apparently, when you're looking at that car on the side, without realizing, the car starts turning towards that. So I feel like it's the same thing. The more you're trying to avoid something, the more you would kind of end up finding yourself in those situations somehow. But if you leave the fear aside, what you said, or if you constantly make a choice despite the fear to know more and focus more on what you want, what you said, to know what are your values.
Mhm.
I value freedom a lot. I value independence, and I really value human growth. So even though I hate business side, I love, doing entrepreneurship, running my company, doing all that, because while I find certain pieces of it not most exciting and there is more risk to fail, I know that it offers me the freedom, the independence, and I get to see the levels of human growth that I would not see if I was still in my old job.
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
couldn't agree with you more. And I want to go back to what you said too. I love the analogy of driving. Like that whole idea of, if you're so afraid of making a mistake, you're going to make a mistake more often because you're not focused, right? And and I think about that too, what you were saying before about the idea of being able to handle it. As adults, we can handle it. We may not like it. It's not pleasant. It might be painful, but we can handle it. Like that is my definition of confidence. I always say to people, confidence is not believing that you're wonderful. Confidence is believing you can handle it.
Yeah.
I think there's a big distinction between those two things, because if we're striving to always feel like we love ourselves and we're fantastic and all the right, that's never going to happen. But if we can just consistently remind ourselves, hey, no matter what happens, I'll deal with it. I have
Yeah.
the resources. I'm an adult. I can figure out a way forward. Then it gives us more courage to actually move in that path that is parallel to fear, right?
Absolutely. I love that definition of confidence that you give. Like, and for me that has been a learning curve.
Me too.
Give me work to get to that, definition of confidence. I always thought confidence look at other people and they just know they are amazing, but that's
Mm.
confidence. That's because that's not real. Nobody is just amazing at everything, and nobody just succeeds at everything that they do. And nobody fails at everything that they do, no matter
Oh.
how real they think that is. So we are not winners or losers. We win and we lose.
You're absolutely right. That balance is really important. And one thing I have learned doing the work that I'm doing, and I'm sure you have too, is that even the people that seem most confident are just putting on a good show. I've been, I think it's been really eye-opening to see how many people who come across as really confident actually struggle with the same things that we're talking about right now. It is human nature to doubt ourselves, to have the kinds of voices that we're talking about. And so it's not shameful, it's just human.
And in fact, a healthy dose of self-doubt is good, as long as that is not overtaking you.
Yes.
If you're taking a decision, or if you're doing certain things, you're being a certain way with your colleagues at work, and you get some feedback. And if you're looking at, oh, wait, and maybe you started out thinking you are right, but then having doubt to question and look at that feedback is great. So a certain amount of doubt is healthy as long as you approach it with objectivity and you don't kind of over focus on it. So say you bring the doubt as one voice,
Yes.
like it board out your own personal mem board, and
Mhm.
so there are different voices, and the doubt is just another voice that's sharing, and you can debate on it and you can discuss it, and you can with a common goal of you thriving as a person.
Yeah. And, I am not a scientist, never have been, never will be, but I often like to think about things in terms of experiments, right? Because when people who work in scientific fields or who do anything that requires, uh, you know, doing some type of trial and error, some type of experimentation, if you can try to look at it through that lens of like, oh, this is unexpected data. What might this be telling me, right? As opposed to it being like, oh no, I'm a complete failure and everything I'm doing is wrong. It's like, no, actually, this is data. And how do I interpret this in the larger context?
Exactly. And what I do, like I try and tell my clients to bring a metaphorical or a real curiosity hat,
Yeah.
like a physical thing that they can call, curiosity hat or curiosity bracelet. I love to kind of have some physical anchors. And when you bring that curiosity that this is happening, like you said, it becomes data, it becomes information, and it's not a personal attack on yourself, by yourself, or by others. So, yes. And having said that, I know it's hard. Even though this is like, right? This is your work, this is my work. We do this day in and day out. And yet when you are in the situation, it can feel hard. So it's important to kind of be kind to yourself. But if your goal is that you remind yourself to look at that as information, as data, stay curious and see what may come out of it, most of the time it's like you're thankful for it a little while later.
You're absolutely right. And I think that's important to remember too, is we think that everything that we're in the middle of right now is unique and this moment is so high stakes. Whereas if we look back and realize like, hey, I've survived every other challenge that I've encountered along the way. I've learned so many things through the mistakes that I've made, right? I would not be here today if it weren't for that. That reminds us too that we can handle it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Pallavi, I could be here all day talking to you. And I know there is so much more where this came from in your book. For people who are listening to this conversation and would love to learn more about you and your work and, the resources that you have available, what would you recommend they do? What kind of resources would you point them to? How can they find you?
Yeah, so first thing I would say is if they are interested in looking more closely to their relationship with themselves, I would point them to just go on Amazon and type relationship with the self and then my name, Pallavi, Pallav. So when you type that and search, you would, get to see the book, a little bit about the book, and you can buy an audio the book from there. You can, if you want to reach out to me, I'm there on LinkedIn. You can also find my website. It's the Wellbeing Ways LLC. Sorry, the website is the Wellbeing Ways. So THEWELLBEING, wellbeingways.com. So
Perfect. Well, I will make sure those links are in the show notes. And thank you so much for being here and sharing these insights. It's really, really helpful to hear your perspective on this. And I really appreciate that you're doing this work.
thank you, Kim. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.